Our last guest for this Beloved Community Talks experience, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who is an author and a professor, well known for the books Nice Racism and White Fragility. Welcome, Dr. DiAngelo, to this Beloved Community Talks experience on understanding racism. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. West. It is an honor to be here. Also, in particular, this is the second anniversary of the death of George Floyd.
Yes.
So a very, very powerful moment in our country. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for sharing that. We're going to mention that at the end and highlight that because it's important that we remember. And a lot of what we're talking about is connected to how we built this momentum after he was murdered. And where are we now? You know, after 2 years later. And so as I wrap up today, I'm going to bring all of that together about Mr. Floyd, how he should be here, Robin, raising his daughter.
Yeah.
And still among us. And even how in Minneapolis, it's been revealed in a recent report, this systemic racism within policing there. And you talk about in your books just the myths around racism and white supremacy. One of them is this idea that affirmative action has been a problem. But one of the things you mentioned that I think is very prevalent, and we see it more and more, even on social media, connects back to Mr. Floyd and to Buffalo and to what's happened in this country concerning race over the last 2 years. And that's the use of Dr. King's quote about content of character from his I Have a Dream speech. The use of this idea that Dr. King was colorblind in order to promote this sense of we shouldn't worry about race anymore. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, clearly you're talking about colorblind ideology, which is a perversion of what Dr. King was saying. What he's saying is we need to create a beloved community in which the color of one's skin doesn't matter, but we're not in that society. So to pretend that we already are is to basically deny racism and systemic racism, and it's to protect the status quo and ultimately functions to prevent us from getting there. To, you know, for me to pretend that your race and my race has no meaning in a society that is profoundly separate and unequal by race is a deep form of denial. And it serves the status quo of white supremacy. And it's heartbreaking to think that someone as radical and activist as Dr. King has been reduced in the mainstream to just this simplistic counter idea, an idea that actually protects racism, doesn't challenge it.
Wow. Can you expound on that a bit more? How does this ideology of colorblindness keep racism going?
Because it pretends that race doesn't matter in a society in which it deeply matters. So the forces of systemic racism were operating on my life before I even took my first breath, before I was even born, so that we could literally predict whether my mother and I were going to survive my birth based on the fact that we're white, where I could be born, what kind of services were there, how my mother's labor was managed in the hospital, who owned the hospital, who came in that night and mopped the floor and changed the sheets. I was born into a racialized hierarchy, and it has shaped every breath I've taken. It's shaped the trajectory of my life. It shaped who I love and who I was warned never to love. And then to proceed as if that isn't operating can only hold it in place.
Wow. You talk about in White Fragility how we're surrounded by messages that enforce white superiority. And you have like several chapters on that, but can you summarize what that means? That we're surrounded by messages that are circulated about white superiority?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say that is there isn't anybody who doesn't know it's better to be white. Right? Let's just say it. Not that white people are better, but that it is better to be white. We all know that. All white people know that. But at the same time, we have to deny that because we've set it up as just very simplistic. You're either racist or you're not. And if you're racist, you're bad. And if you're not racist, you're good. And so I must deny all of that. I think one of the most powerful, for me, actually, the most powerful message of white supremacy is the comfort with which most white people live segregated lives.
Mm-hmm.
Most white people go cradle to grave in racial segregation with no sense whatsoever that anything or anyone of value has been missing. And if we're being really honest, we measure the value of our spaces by the absence of Black people.
Mm.
I know what a good school is. I know what we're talking about. I know
With
what a
no Black
bad
people.
I know
Right.
what a bad, well, for you, a good school might be less white people. But in the mainstream, right? A good neighborhood, a good school, the whiter it is, the more status it has. To live one's life with no sense of loss, not to know or love Black people, and I'm speaking specifically as a white person, I was not meant to know or love or care about Black people. Um, that is a very deep message. To talk about um, enforced segregation on Blacks in the Jim Crow South as some kind of tragedy, but to talk in glowing terms about white neighborhoods, um,
Right.
that there's a message there. Right. And it's reinforced day in and day out. That's just one way. And of course, I mean, imagery, when I'm giving a presentation and I want just one image that captures for me the concept of white supremacy and how early I internalized it, I just show the Sistine Chapel, God creating man. Can you see that picture? We've got God and all the angels, and he's touching, man. As a child, I didn't look up at images like that and say, oh, God is white. And it's just so relentless and so unremarkable, but also so implicitly clear. Right.
Mm. I want to grab something you said, because sometimes we can hear one thing and people run with it. We can run with it and say, oh, she said it's better to be white. I really want to dive into that, because what you're saying is true. I hear you, because what we see in society is this idea that white is the ideal, and it also paints this picture that whiteness is what's correct. But what you're also saying is, economically, in terms of healthcare, in terms of the ability to get loans, we're seeing now with the black women giving birth, how they're in more danger than white women. There's a disproportionate amount of Black people on death row. So there's a connection between racism, and the death penalty, incarceration, the school to prison pipeline. The list goes on. Discipline in schools. Black girls are disciplined differently than white girls. Black boys differently than white boys, and what you're saying to us is just the truth in this nation and around the globe, that there is a better quality of life overall for white people than for Black people. We saw that with the results of COVID. So that's real talk. Even in some of the conversations, when Jane Elliott asked the question, would you rather be white or Black? Would you want to be treated the way Black people are treated? Nobody stands.
Right.
So
Right.
that lets us know there's a truth in what she's saying.
Yeah, there are two pieces to that. One, of course, there is that it is the ideal, the measure of ideal, the standard for humanity, but it also is a structural advantage. And I
Structural
think
advantage.
both Tim and Charles mapped that out really well. I grew up in poverty. And I knew from a very early age the shame of poverty and that life was not fair. But I also always knew that I was white. I knew that it was better to be white. Being white meant while I dealt with poverty and classism, I wasn't also dealing with racism. That gave me more resources to navigate poverty. My whiteness helped me leave poverty. And when I'm interacting with somebody today, they're not thinking, oh, she used to be poor, right? To say that a poor white person and a poor Black person have the same experience, it's just not true. So when we talk about white advantage, it doesn't mean that white people don't suffer. It doesn't mean that white people don't experience marginalization, but we don't suffer from racism or experience that marginalization. And that helps us navigate the forms of oppression that we do face.
Wow. Listen, you need to tweet post right now. Be sure to watch this segment with Robin DiAngelo. I want you to get that out there. Use the hashtags below community talks, hashtag courageous conversations, hashtag end racism. We need to end racism. And what we're talking about today in this beloved community talks experience, it's going to help us do that. And I'll summarize that in the last segment. But I want to ask you, Robin, about Dr. King's writing about the white moderate in Letter from Birmingham Jail, and how that's connected to this idea of the title of your last book, Nice Racism.
Mm-hmm.
Nice racism. How would you connect those two concepts, nice racism and the white moderate? He says he's disappointed in the white moderate who's more devoted to order than to justice. It's what he talks about, more devoted to order than to justice, in his seminal writing, Letter from Birmingham Jail. How would you connect white moderates to racism?
Well,
racism.
If we understand racism as a system that we are all in, that no one could be exempt from, then my racism, the ways in which I was socialized into racism, my enactment and upholding of that system, it doesn't look like white nationalists. I'm not a white nationalist, but it does look like something. I am not exempt from this system. And it's on me to continually ask, so what does my forms look like? Right? Why do so many Black people who live and work in primarily white space? Now, you're not hanging around in those white spaces, white nationalists. Most Black people know to avoid white nationalists, sometimes actually rather be with a white nationalist because it's right there out front on the table. But who you're interacting with are well-meaning, well-intentioned white people like me. And our forms of racism are more insidious, harder to get your hands on, more easily gaslit. There's a knife in your back, but a smile on our faces. You're being undermined, everywhere you go, but you can't get a hold of it. That's what I call nice racism. If it's a system and we're in it, then we all participate in it, right? There's only two positions. There's no neutral place. And white moderates can be so sure that they're not the problem that we're profoundly resistant to seeing anything to the contrary. We can be the most defensive, the most arrogant, right? The most sure that our work is done, right? And then we go and point at everybody else, right? So, I think that white moderates can cause the most daily harm. That doesn't mean I don't take white nationalism seriously. But there's a lot of folks out here, and as nice and well-intended as I was raised to be, we're still getting the same outcome. So what role do I play? And that's the question I think every white person needs to ask themselves.
Help us answer that quickly as we close out. What would be the first thing you would say to answer that question? What role can I play as a white person in eradicating racism?
I don't believe that white people are innocent of race at all, right? So this kind of claim that I don't know anything about it, the number one question I get from white people is, what do I do? And before I answer that, I always say, well, how have you managed to be a full functioning, educated, professional adult and not know what to do about racism in 2022?
Wow.
If you went to the doctor and the doctor said you have an acoustic neuroma, which you'd never heard of, and then they got called into an emergency, you had to go home, what would you
Google
do?
it.
You would Google it for hours.
Yes.
You would get on every discussion board. It's 2022. The information's everywhere.
Out there.
So let me recommend Dr. Eddie Moore's 21-day racial equity habit building challenge. It's a program you do every single day for 21 days, often in a team. Anything that keeps you engaged is really important, especially for white people, because complacency is so seductive for us. Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy workbook is excellent. Resma Menicum's My Grandmother's Hands. There are so many good resources out there. I suppose I would close by saying, just assume that you are part of the problem and then really care to find out how you are part and change it. It's transformative. It's liberating. It's not all guilt and terrible.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us for this Beloved Community Talks experience. Someone says, wow, Ms. DiAngelo, I could listen to you all day. We have received so many great comments about Tim, about Charles, about Robin. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for being with us, Robin. We look forward to seeing you again, to having you be a part of another Beloved Community Talks experience. And on behalf of Dr. King, thank you so much.
Thank you for the honor.